Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to another installment of our monthly 9 to 9 class. As Rachel pointed out, it's a high class, it's our 18th class. So we're very excited to be here again. We're in the minor prophets. I know people don't like to actually use that term anymore, with Amos and Hosea. Rachel is a beloved Mayan teacher who blogs and is most importantly a Mayan teacher right now. So we're very happy to have her with us. So Rachel, take it away.
Thank you. Just Ilana, can you please mute everyone? And then when we start having a discussion, and we certainly will, just unmute and mute yourself as the need arises. Just if we don't mute ourselves at first, it becomes very difficult with the...
Okay. Okay, I'll mute everyone. If you can mute yourself, that would be helpful. But I'll just work on muting everybody because Zoom seems to have changed their features.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so as first of all, hi. It's really nice to see you on this 18th meeting of our book club, so to speak. And it's not just that it's the 18th meeting. It's also that we're starting a different part of the Hebrew Bible. If until now we more or less stayed within a chronological arc, you know, we started with the creation of the world, with Abraham and his family, with the formation of the Jewish people in the crucible of the Egyptian subjugation, and then we moved forward with the history of how the Jews left Egypt, made it to Israel, built a country, existed as tribes, created a kingdom, and then the history of those kingdoms, the big prophets of the end of the era of the temple, destruction, seen both from the point of view of in the moment through Jeremiah, and then from the outside through Ezekiel, who was already in exile by then. And now we get to a group of 12 prophets who prophesied throughout something like 200 years, two and change centuries. Some of them prophesied quite a long time ago in the chronology, meaning if we reach the end of the destruction of the temple, some of the prophecies go 100 years back, 150 years back. Some of them go to the beginning of the second temple, to the 1520s, 1516 BCE. So we have a whole mishmash of prophecies that belong to different eras, that refer to different stages, very distinct stages in the Jewish story. And just to make us work for our money, they're not in order. So whenever we open any one of them, we really have to try and get a sense of where is it that we're standing. And for today's class specifically, where we're standing is in the northern kingdom, not in Judea. All the prophets we saw so far, which was Yeshayahu, Yechezkel, and Yirmiyahu, were all prophets in Judea. Yechezkel naturally was not. He was in Babylonia, but he was from Judea. Now we're talking about the northern kingdom, the kingdom that tore itself away from Judea in the days of the son of King Shlomo, King Rehoboam. So we're in the northern kingdom. We're circa mid-8th century BCE, and we're at the time of the reign of a king named Yerovam II, not the original Yerovam, naturally. Now, this Yerovam II is the great-grandson of a man named Yehu, who started his life as a general in the army, not as a king, not as a son of a king, and then in a religiously sanctioned revolution, and I'll speak about it in a second, in a religiously, prophetically sanctioned revolution, got rid of the previous dynasty, the dynasty that was called Beit Omri, the house of Omri, and founded his own dynasty. Now, Beit Omri, the house that he was sent to displace, and I know that I'm going back to themes that we discussed before and themes that I assume to some extent everybody's somewhat at least familiar with, but we're just going to have to do a little bit of catch up to have a sense of where we're standing. So the house of Omri was famous for being politically and diplomatically extremely savvy. they took a kingdom that was, one of the kingdoms of the region, not particularly strong, not particularly powerful, and turned it into a powerhouse through a series of very judicial alliances with other kingdoms all around them. Amongst them, by the way, the kingdom of Judea. During the times of the house of Omri, the relationship between the two, what we would call Jewish, then they wouldn't call it Jewish, states were at their peak. But all this diplomacy also meant a lot of interaction with other nations and bringing in a lot of idolatry into the northern kingdom, into the kingdom of Israel. Specifically, the son of Omri, who was the founder of that dynasty, Achav, King Achav, famously married a princess from Sidon, from the kingdom to the north, Jezebel, Jezebel, whose name has become famous for reasons that a lot of people, it's funny sometimes, you hear people talk about Jezebel, non-Jews. You ask them, who was Jezebel? Nobody knows, but everybody knows she's bad. Somehow she made it into the pantheon of big bads. So in our tradition, the reason she's so bad is twofold. One, she brought with her the worship of the Baal, the local worship of the king of rain, and introduced it into Israel, not as another thing that people can do, which was already there. People worshiped our God, but also worshipped others at the same time. So she did worse. She turned it into a state religion. And she persecuted the prophets of God and destroyed the worship of God to make room for the worship of the Baal. Now, that's only one reason. That's only part of the story. The other part of the story was that she encouraged her husband to rule in a very autocratic way. If you remember the famous story when, for example, King Achav wanted don't know why that happened. Can you hear me now? Okay. So when King Achav wanted to buy the vineyard of one of his subjects, Navot, and Navot refused, Jezebel told him, what's the big deal? And organized a trial for Navot and trumped up charges and got him executed for it and told Achav, now take the field, now take the vineyard for yourself. And the truth is that those two things, the religious worship of the Baal and the might is right attitude to power, to leadership, are not as disconnected as they may at first appear. Can anyone translate the word Baal, what it means?
Owner.
Owner, exactly. Also husband in Hebrew, and we'll come back to that soon. But exactly, owner. And the idea of worship of the Baal is that we worship the owner of the land, this who can make the land fertile. And there's a strong emphasis on the might and power of this owner that we worship. When historians and anthropologists talk about the religions of the ancient Eastern religions, they often emphasize that all of them, with the exception, well, never mind, all of them, had this assumption that as below, so above, and as above, so below. So just as the gods rule with an iron fist and own the land and grant favors to those they favor, so should the king below rule. Just as the kings rule in the heavens, so should the king rule on earth. So when Achav takes what he wants, he is modeling himself on the Baal, on this king who king of the world, whose kingship is defined in ownership, in exploitation, in taking benefits, and maybe granting favors if he so pleases. It may sound weird to us to just assume that human leadership should be like godly leadership, and that somehow the world we live in, the society we live in, has to reflect exactly the theology of how God is in the world, but this was more so than in monotheistic religions, where we also say imitate Yodei, we're supposed to imitate God. More so, it was a whole way of living that was based on these principles. So the house of Omri, 100 years before Yerovam HaSheni, where we're going to talk about today, sorry about this long-winded introduction, it's necessary, really brought into the northern kingdom this combination of idolatry, worship of the Baal, and a Baal-like, an owner-like attitude to the subjects, to the people under their rule. And God, through Eliyahu, a Navi who went and criticized Achav at every turn, and then later through Eliyahu's student and heir, Elisha, is bringing about a revolution. Elisha is told to encourage Yehu, the general, to start a revolution and dispossess the house of Omri and start a kingdom under his own reign. Elisha doesn't do it himself. He sends out on disciple. If you can remind me at the end of the class, I'll say something about that, but it's just a side note, so we're not going to focus on that now. But it's interesting. Elisha doesn't do it himself. Yehu hears the prophecy about how he's supposed to become king with great joy and no hesitation, and goes on to conduct a real bloodbath. He doesn't just kill the king. He kills the king. At this point, it's Achav's son. He kills the king's siblings. He kills everybody who's related in any way. He kills the king of Judea, who was related by marriage to the house of Omri and happened to be visiting in the northern kingdom at the time. He kills Jezebel, the mother of the king, the famous Jezebel from all the stories. He kills anybody and everybody, even children, that he can, and he founds his own kingdom. At first, the kingdom and dynasty of Yehu is a little spotty. They are constantly engaged in wars with their neighbor Aram, where Syria is today. And these wars constantly cause them losses, successes. Sometimes they're going better, sometimes they're doing worse. By the days of King Jerovam II, the great-grandson of Yehu, the great revolutionary, they have a reprieve from their war with Aram. Does anybody know why they have this reprieve? Any guesses? So the truth is that the reason is somewhat ironic, because the reason they're doing so well, the reason that the northern kingdom suddenly is prosperous and successful and all those things, is that there's this new power rising to the farther north in Mesopotamia. And that power is Assyria, the kingdom of Ashur. And the kingdom of Ashur is engaging all the kingdoms around it in war in order to create its own empire. And for a while, it's not strong enough to engage Israel itself, but it is strong enough to engage Aram, Syria, in war, and therefore Aram can't defend itself against the kingdom of Israel that expands itself, becomes extremely rich, conquers new lands in Transjordan, and for one glorious moment is again a beautiful, prosperous, rich, successful, respected kingdom. And it's in this moment that we're starting the story of new kinds of prophets, the story of the prophets that are sometimes called the literary prophets, prophets whose main activism is not like we saw with Eliyahu, for example, before, or like Shmuel in counseling kings and being activists among the people, or like with Natan being court prophets to King David. Now we're seeing kings whose main job is to speak truth to power, is to use the power of their rhetoric to present a certain perception of what God desires from us and in what way we're falling short, and who are often rebuked, disregarded, disbelieved until it is too late. And these prophets appear in that moment of prosperity, which sadly, and here I'm spoiling the rest of the story here, spoiler alert, is the highlight and the high point. Because from this point, there's going to be a very quick deterioration. King Yerovoam's kingdom, so powerful, so successful, is not going to outlast his son. His son will be murdered, and then there's going to be a quick succession of assassinations and coups every time a new king will come, either backed by Assyria or sometimes backed by Egypt, and will pull the kingdom in a different diplomatic direction. And every time there's going to be invasions from Assyria, and they're going to tear more and more land, until in 7023 BCE, Assyria conquers all of the northern kingdoms and exiles everybody who lives there. But at this point in time, 100 years earlier, the people don't know it yet. What the people know is that they're successful, that they're rich, that they won the wars, that their neighbor to the north, Aram, is no longer bothering them. And furthermore, and this is perhaps where it's really curious, they're confident that the reason they're doing so well is because they are the descendants of Yehu, a king who was chosen by God himself. They're a God-sanctioned kingdom, just like Beit David in Jerusalem. They were chosen by God to create a righteous kingdom. And they go and they are very pious. They're careful to bring sacrifices and burnt offerings to God, and and pray and do all the things that they're supposed to do for God, and they're convinced that this is why they are successful. But at the same time, there's horrible corruption, there's horrible exploitation, and we will get to that later on. So let's look at the first, at these two different prophets, Amos and Hosea, who step onto the stage at this moment in time. Just a moment. I don't know if that is clear. Yeah. Let's start with Hosea. The first words in the book of Hosea are, "The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Be'eri, in the reigns of kings Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, and Chizkiah of Judea, and in the reign of King Yerovam, son of Joash of Israel." So first of all, the first thing to notice here is that this is a very confusing sentence. Because when we look at the chronology, and I regret I did not bring a chronological line, but you'll just have to take me at my word, I'm afraid. When we look at the chronology, and we look at those kings of Judea, and we look at the king of Israel that he's told, that we hear of different kings of Judea, right? Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, Chizkiah, and only one king in Israel, Yerovam, and the timelines don't match. The Judean line lasts much longer than the Israelite, the time that Yerovam was king in Israel. So what is it? Was Hosea a prophet at the time of all those kings of Judea, long after the reign of Yerovam? Or was he only a prophet in the time of Yerovam? Why is the text starting with this confusing statement that doesn't match historical record? So some commentators say that this is the storyteller's way to express its disdain for the kings that came after Yerovam. As I said before, the kings after Yerovam don't last long. One assassin takes the place of another assassin, one coup takes the place of another coup, etc., so that the prophecy here starts by kind of rudely ignoring all those kings as if they don't mean anything, as if there's no substance in them. But if we think this is shocking, let's see what God tells Hosea to do in the next sentence. Let's look at verse 2. When the Lord first spoke to Hosea, and in Hebrew it says not exactly that. It says, first, when God spoke to Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go, get yourself a wife of whoredom, Eshet Znunim, and children of whoredom, for the land will stray from following the Lord." So there's an awful lot of argument in the commentators as to whether Hosea was actually expected to take a whore for a wife, or whether this was a dream or a message or a parable. For the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to talk as if he's actually doing it. But the points, the messages, the ideas apply even if it's just an image in his mind. We're just going, for convenience's sake, to assume Abarbanel's position, who said that that it was an actual marriage that Hoshea actually had to do. And my question to you is this: when the people around Hoshea see him marrying a whore, what do you think they think as they're looking at it? Or let's say if he's not marrying her, for when he tells them, God told me to marry a whore, forgive my language here, I'm quoting. What do you think it makes them think, in your opinion? There's no wrong answers, but I'd appreciate any.
That he's not truthful by saying that it's a command from God, that it's a personal choice that he's making under the guise of an edict.
That's a very interesting
edict.
That's a very interesting way to look at it.
Yes? I think the people would be horrified with telling him such a thing.
It's interesting. You're presenting two positions. Chaya is saying that they wouldn't believe that God said it. They'll say, oh, yeah, right. You just wanted to marry her, and now you're trying to justify it. And Debbie, you're saying that if they were to believe him that God said it, they would say, what? They would be horrified by it. Anybody else wants to comment? Eileen?
That it would tend to make them disbelieve anything Hosea then says. So it's as if it's a way of ensuring that they won't listen to his pleas for them to change.
Interesting. I think coming hot on the heels of what we learned in Yechezkel, who's told in particular, you're going to talk to them and I'm going to make them not believe in you. I see what you're saying. And that would be interesting if it's supposed to somehow discredit him and force them to work harder if they wish to believe him. Anybody else? Sorry, who is it?
Naomi.
Yes, Naomi.
Or they could be so immune to it because it's such a corrupted society anyway that it doesn't make any difference. It's no different than what they see all around them. So he's one of them, and so maybe it's just the opposite. He's just like they are, and they can identify with him maybe, or maybe they don't see him as judgmental, or maybe they.
The edict itself is strange because he's ordered to do something extremely untoward, so to speak. And it's like because of the anticipation of the greater sins of the people. So is it supposed to be a model or a cautionary tale that this is so horrible that we will not follow? It's an odd kind of educational approach.
Very odd, and that's partly why the Rambam, Maimonides, for example, insisted that there's no way we can interpret it as if God really expected him to do that, because Maimonides said, how can God ask someone to do something wrong? And Abarbanel said, no, sometimes there are exceptions. There's the rule, but sometimes God tells us to do unusual things. God tells Abraham, bind your son and hold a knife to his neck. This is not a normal thing that God tells everybody to do. This is something that's supposed to create some sort of statement, some sort of impression that transcends the normal and gives it meaning. So we don't know. I think maybe what comes up from hearing so many different opinions and seeing that they're all valid interpretations is that it's extremely confusing. It's not an obvious and clear message. There's something really odd and really distressing in this prophecy, and it's very unusual. It really stands out. There's a reason why it's so famous, the story of Hoshea and his marriage, because it stands out as an unusual thing. Another interpretation that I want to suggest is in the name of Rav Yoel bin Nun from Israel. He said that when you read the story of, and that's why I started with Beit Omri, when you read the story of King Achav and Queen Jezebel, and you read about how they were perceived, and you see how strong was the impression they left, that years later people remember the house of Omri, it makes sense to assume that when King Hoshea says, Eshet Znunim, a woman of whoredom, a whore woman, people assume he's referring or alluding to Jezebel. There's a certain hint here to Jezebel. And people might even say, oh yeah, I guess you're making a point about how terrible those kings 100 years ago were, right? That's the point you're about to make. And then let's look at what God tells him to do next. We'll skip Amos for now. We'll come back to Amos later. He takes his wife. Let's read Hosea in box number 2. So he went and married Gomer, daughter of Divlaim. She conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord instructed him, name him Israel. So Rav Yoel Ben-Nun says, so first the prophet says, I need to marry a whore. And everybody in their mind is like, oh yeah, Jezebel, that whore. Like that's what people called her. That's really how people referred to her. Then he says, oh, my whore wife had a son. And what's the assumption? That she's unfaithful. So he can't know if it's his son. But she had a son. And now I'm going to call him Israel, which was the seat of Beit Omri, of the former dynasty. And at this point, everybody around him who's either watching it happen or hearing him telling it as a parable, again, depending on the interpretation, can assume that what Hosea is about to do is criticize the sins of the dynasty that existed 100 years earlier, that their kingdom, the kingdom of their time, of Yerovam II, is supposed to be the antithesis of. You understand what I'm saying? Antithesis. Thank you. Of that. So, in a sense, he's using a rhetorical device here. He's getting them to think that they're about to agree with him, so that then when he tells them, you are the one in the wrong, they're going to be shocked. They're going to say, what? We who were founded to replace that? We are like that? You're talking about us? We were sure you're talking about them. But then he tells them very clearly that that's not what he's talking about. And here's what he says. Let's go back to verse 4 here. Name him Israel, for I will soon punish the house of Yehu. At this point, maybe some of the listeners said, hey, you got it wrong. You meant to say the house of Omri. But he goes on. For the bloody deeds at Israel, and put an end to the monarchy of the house of Israel. In that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Israel. And the story continues. She conceived again and bore a daughter. And he said to him, name her Lo Ruchama. Ruchama is, Lerachem is to have compassion to someone. So Lo Ruchama is someone who isn't spared through compassion. And again, Rav Yoel Ben-Nun, sorry?
Sorry.
And again, Rav Yoel Ben-Nun says that when those people heard Lo Ruchama, what not spared, they probably had a very strong association for Jezebel's daughter. Jezebel's daughter was Atalia, who married into the Judean kingdom and then went and killed everybody there and had no mercy for anybody. But no, the prophet is not talking about those misdeeds of 100 years ago. He's talking about these people. These people are so convinced that everything is just great and that they're doing everything right. No, he's talking about them. And he said to him, name her Lo Ruchama, for I will no longer accept the house of Israel or pardon them. But I will accept the house of Judah. And I will give them victory through the Lord their God. I will not give them victory with bow and sword in battle, by horses and riders. After weaning Lo Ruchama, she, that is, Gomer, the wife, conceived and bore a son. Then he said, name him Lo Ami, not my nation, not my people. For you are not my people, and I will not be your God. So whether the prophet is actually marrying this woman and having these 3 children or not, the message is a shocking message. The message is, not only are you not, and you, I mean Kingdom of Israel, not only are you not the righteous, upright, godly sanctioned kingdom that you think you are not my people. I will not spare you, and I will kill all of you sometime soon. I'll let Judah live, the other kingdom, but you are done. This is a very harsh and very devastating message. And just to put it in perspective, this is the first literary prophet. This is before Yeshayahu speaks in Judea. This is really the first time that the people are hearing this kind of prophecy, at least that we have a record of it. We can't. Yes, Chaya.
I found it astounding that in order to create respect or adherence to a faith, 3 little children are chosen to carry throughout their lifetime an admonition, a penalty for something that they have really no connection to, beside the genetic fact that they were born to parents that were part of a sinning nation. It's so cruel.
I agree. It's very, again, it's more comfortable to go to Maimonides here and say, no, it's just a parable. But I think that it's important to try and think of it as reality because it's so shocking, because it's so horrifying. But I just want to say,
or that the sins of the parents will be visited on the children for several generations. But that's a heavy load.
Yeah, it is a heavy load. And in particular here, because it's not even just that they're the sons of a sinning nation. Here it's just because their father's job requires it. It's like, imagine somebody naming their kids after the policies in their company to make an advertisement for it's like, I mean, obviously being a servant of God and being in a company is not the same. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply that. But I just do want to say that the names are changing, and we'll get to that. Their names will be changed later in their lives. But first, let's see what happens next, because it's a little surprising. You know, after this horrible message, after God said, have this wife, have these children, call these children this way, live in the world with these names hanging over you, where when people invite you for dinner, they ask, how many of your kids are going to come? And you're going to say, oh, all 3 of them. And what are their names? Israel, Lo Ruchama, Lo Ami. Why are their names so weird? Because God is going to kill us all. Like, yeah, great. Maybe don't come to dinner instead. Like, imagine just living with that. We expect the story to continue in a similar vein, but then there's suddenly a shift in the tone of the story. In the next verse, which is also the next chapter, this is what the prophet says. The number of the people of Israel shall be like that of the sands of the sea, which cannot be measured or counted. And instead of being told, you are not my people, lo ami, they shall be called bnei el chai, children of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel shall assemble together and appoint one head over them, namely they'll be united again. And they shall rise from the ground, for marvelous shall be the day of Israel. Just like lo ami changed into bnei el chai, now Israel is no longer the place of a bad disaster, but rather a place of revival. Oh, he says in verse 3, call your brothers my people, and your sister lovingly accepted, ruchama, pardoned, spared, lovingly accepted. What? We just heard about how everything is going to be terrible, and now without any connection, without any bridge, without any explanation of what's going on, now we're hearing this weird, oh, everything is going to be great, they're going to be reunited, they're going to revive, and all the meanings of all the names will be turned on their heads. What happened here? This is a very odd jump, and without any explanation. And now, this is where we're really entering the realm of interpretation, because Hosea, and the truth is not only Hosea, a lot of the prophets in these group of 12 prophets that we're entering now are very difficult texts. They're very brief, they're segmented. There's a strong feeling in most of them, perhaps with the exception of Yonah, that we're missing a large part of the story, and we have to interpret heavily. So here's one interpretation of this jump from the first chapter with its devastation and the second chapter that starts so well. And it's a pretty ancient interpretation. It appears in Masechet Psachim in the Babylonian Talmud. And you have it in your source sheet, but because our time is short, we're not going to read it. I'm just going to sum it up for you. You're welcome to read it later for yourself. According to the Talmud, Hoshea's whole job as a prophet started when God told him, Chatu banai, my sons sinned. And we'll look, at least in the beginning, we will look at the text because I want to make sure we have it right. Sorry, he didn't say my sons sinned. He said your sons have sinned. Now, when God says that, what does he want Hosea to say, in your opinion? When he says your sons sinned. Let's think about similar situations with Moshe, right? When God tells him, your people sinned, your charges sinned. What does Moshe do?
He says, I didn't give birth to them. They're not mine.
They're not mine. And even stronger than that, he says, no, they're your sons. Have mercy on them. So God is basically, I don't know the expression for it, but God is basically inviting Hosea to speak in support of the Jewish people. He's making an opening for them. He's using code words that everybody who reads the Torah and Moshe's story and Moshe's arguments with God should recognize. But instead, what does Hosea say, according to the Talmud? This is not in the Pshat. Hosea says, oh, you have a lot of nations in the world. Just switch. Get rid of these ones and make a different nation your nation. What's the big deal? And God said, what? You were supposed to say, they're your sons. You don't understand that? You don't understand? You can't. God says, you don't understand that? You can't be someone whose job is to rebuke if you don't believe in the ability of the people you're rebuking to improve. Rabbi Akiva, in a different place, says, I wonder if in my generation anybody is able to really do the mitzvah of tochacha, of rebuke. And the rabbis ask, what does that mean? I mean, the generation of Rabbi Akiva, there's all these great rabbis. But the idea is that if you don't truly love the people that you're telling off, don't bother. Because the whole point is you want to improve them. And if you don't believe that they can be, don't go down this road. So Hosea, whose job is to be a prophet to the people, to try and tell them things that will inspire them to become better, to do better, he doesn't believe in them. He thinks God should exchange them. So God says, you know what? I'm going to teach you what it is to have sons and to have valid reasons for anger and yet not wishing to experience this anger, not wishing to do bad to your sons. So he tells him, go ahead, marry a woman whose faithfulness, or let's say it this way, whose unfaithfulness is well known. Have her carry children that maybe are yours, maybe are not yours. Give them all these names and then get rid of them. Divorce her and send her and her children, who are probably not even your children, away. And then Hosea says, I can't do that. I love them. They're my children. I can't do that. And God said, So now you see what it is. Now you see what the problem is and what you did before. This is what it means to have children. It kind of reminds us of Yonah, doesn't it? Like God needs to teach the prophet how to be a sanegor, advocate for the people who he's supposed to correct. And then Hosea prays, please let me keep my children. And God says, before you pray for yourself, pray for the people. And Hosea prays for the people. And according to the Talmud, the text we saw before, the beginning of chapter 2 of Hosea, is what Hosea's prayer is. It's Hosea praying for a better fate for the Jewish people than the fate that God promised them through that parable or not parable of Hosea's family. But here we already see somehow within all this story, within all this underlying story, and within this jump from the wife to the children, something weird happens. And what happens is that when Hosea continues the prophecy, he's no longer focusing on the children. Now he's focusing on the wife. And he tells his children, rebuke, or not his children, the Jewish people, however you imagine that. Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. And let her put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. Else will I strip her naked and leave her as on the day she was born. And I will make her like a wilderness, render her like desert land, and let her die of thirst. And then again he goes to the children. I will also disown her children, for they are now a harlot's brood. So in the context of the Talmudic interpretation of that, the point that God was trying to make is that Hosea questioned the relationship between God and his people when God was trying to kind of hint to him that it's a relationship like a parent and a child. It's an undissolvable relationship. But what God is trying to show him is that even the dissolvable relationship of being a spouse, of being a husband, is difficult to dissolve. Because Hosea not only doesn't want to send his children away, he also doesn't want to divorce his wife. He has a connection with her. She's the mother of these children. He doesn't want to send her away. And yet God is coming with this powerful prophecy and saying, this wife of mine, this adulterous wife of mine, I'm going to throw her out and take away everything and let her die of thirst in the desert. And in this weird fragmented jump from children to wife, we're witnessing a terrifying transformation in the language of the prophecy. And this is really a pivotal moment, because until this moment in the history of the entire Bible, Hebrew Bible, until this historical point, again, I'm reminding you that Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, and Chizkiah are all later. We're going to get to them later. We're rewinding to a point in time before them. Until this point, the relationship between God and his people was always presented either as a relationship of king and subjects or as a relationship of parents and children. And there's something very comforting about the parent and child relationship because it's undissolvable. Because no matter what happens, blood will tell, right? There's a certain immutability to it. The second Hosea introduces this marital language, he's opening the door for, to put it bluntly, divorce. And this must be a shocking moment for his listeners, and it must be a shocking moment for him. Because suddenly what he's telling them is not only God is mad at you, he's telling them God is seriously considering to do that thing which, according to the Talmud, I told God to do, namely switch nations. God can't step away from it. But Hosea doesn't leave it here. After taking us through one revolution from children to wife, he's also revolutionizing what the relationship between husband and wife can be. And this is how he does it. After this strong series of horrible statements about how God, the husband, will disown, dispossess, punish Israel, the wife, suddenly he changes his tone. And he says in Hosea chapter 2, verse 16, and it's in box 6 in the source sheet for those looking on paper. Assuredly, I will speak coaxingly to her and lead her through the wilderness and speak to her tenderly. Note that before that, the wilderness was a place where God sent her away to die. Now the wilderness is a place where he takes her to be intimate, to be alone, to be far away from all those foreign lovers that she's attracted to just be the two of them and recreate a language of intimacy. I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor as a plowland of hope. There she shall respond as in the days of her youth, when she came up from the land of Egypt. And in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me Ishi, my man, and no more will you call me Baali, my husband or my owner. For I will remove the names of the Baalim from her mouth, and they shall never more be mentioned by name. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead to verse 21. And I will espouse you forever. Here in Hebrew it says ve'erastich. I will engage. We will be engaged forever. I will espouse you with righteousness and justice and with goodness and mercy. Ve'erastich li le'olam, ve'erastich li betzedek, be'mishpat, u'be'emunah, u'be'rachamim. And on that day, says God, and I'm jumping again to verse 25, I will sow her in the land as my own and take Lo Ruchama back in favor, and I will say to Lo Ami, you are my people, and he will respond, you are my God. What? We were going in one direction, showing how not only are the sons named in these horrible, portentous names, but the wife will be thrown out and abused and punished and physically punished. And then all of a sudden we're talking about a restoration of their relationship. How do we suddenly move from dissolution to restoration? What's going on here? Does anybody want to comment? We're going to continue, but in a high tension moment like this, I feel like we should stop for a second and catch our breath. Does anybody want to comment, ask, challenge? So I'll continue. Yes, Chaya?
It sounds so one-sided. She, whoever it is, a human or a nation, doesn't seem to be responding in a corrective manner or in a worsening manner. It sounds arbitrary. As you said, it's all of a sudden it changes, but with no clue to what has been driving it. So it is a mystery.
Yeah.
Has it been that the nation has changed its ways and have repented or started from a new leaf, declared faith? It's very hard.
Yeah, it's not clear. It's not clear, and it's almost as if we can read it in two ways. We can read it one way and say it's all about God. God can change his mind. God can come with this anger, and then God, in his graciousness and his mercy, will say, you know what, let's try again. Let's try it again. Another way to say it is that there's an implied either or message here, that when Hosea gives these two descriptions, he's basically telling the people, this is a choose your own adventure kind of story here. If you continue sinning, this will happen. If you choose the right, page 42, this will happen. So that's another way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that something happened, but we're not told about it, that God sees something in them. We don't know. One of the interpretations, again, from Rav Yoel Binun and Rav Tzvi Elon, and a lot of rabbis say a similar idea. They say, no, it's not choose this or that. It's not God plans to do all those bad things, but then changes his mind. First, the bad things have to happen. The people need to live through the consequences of the dissolution of their relationship with God, because there's not going to be any opening for restoration, for tshuva on their part, if they don't experience it. They're so confident in their righteousness and their place in the world, in their prosperity, and there was a lot of prosperity at the time, and we'll talk about it in a second, that they're not open for a new kind of relationship. So first, the bad things will have to come to pass. And then the exile, the destruction will be a tragedy, but also an opportunity, because that wilderness that they're going to find themselves in, the unknown of exile, the unknown of a life out of Israel, will also be an opportunity to form a new intimacy with God and a new kind of relationship. And this new kind of relationship, and I wouldn't dare say it if Hosea didn't say it himself, would be better than the relationship that God established with the people throughout their history. Because when God says, on that day you will no longer call me Ba'ali, my owner and my husband, but rather Ishi, my man. What God is saying, and again, I apologize, I feel like I shouldn't be saying that, but it's there in the text. What God is saying is that the texture of his relationship with us in some way is not that different than the texture of the relationship that the people of the ancient East are having with the Baal. And I spoke about it at length in the beginning, and that's why I made such a big deal of this long introduction in the beginning about the Baal and the religions of the Near East, because this whole religious experience that the people who worship the Baal had, the relationship where the God is above and we are below, and he is the owner, and we beg for scraps, and we bring obeisance, and we hope for the best, that those in power will help us. And if we happen to be those in power, then we behave the same way we expect God to behave. This whole texture, this whole harsh, coarse, exploitative understanding of relationship, of power from above, obedience, and kind of begging from below, was brought into the relationship of the people with our God. Somehow, the relationship with God went awry. And instead of being in a covenant with God, in a covenant that makes us realize our potential for human dignity, Art Tselem Elohim, aspire for being higher and higher from a moral perspective, somehow it became a relationship where we feel dependent, where we feel owned, where we feel like we need to just kind of like bat our eyelashes and ask for something very, very nicely, and then maybe we'll get it. Like, this is not how God wants us to relate to him. And God is telling us there will be destruction, but after the destruction, we have an opportunity to do something amazing. We have an opportunity to start again, and this time, start as equals. Start as two people in a mutually helpful, mutually intimate relationship. Now, what does it mean to be equal with God is a complicated question. And within the limits of our short time together, I can't really get into it right now. I'll leave it to you to think about what it means to be in a relationship with God, where it's not God is the mover and shaker, and we are the passive recipients who are sometimes loyal to him and sometimes other lovers and go to them to get stuff from them, and mostly stay in the relationship because we can get things out of it, like wine and wheat. If you look at the text in the source sheet, you'll see those references to the physical things that the people get out of their relationship. But rather a relationship that we choose, that we pursue, that we shape as much as God shapes it. This is what God invites us to do through Hosea. I fear that we have relegated Amos to a 5-minute discussion, which is a bit rude, but we'll try and blitz our way through it because I think it's important. Amos shows up on the scene around the same time as Hosea, but he is extremely different in two very important respects. The first respect is clear if you look at his introduction. Let's go back to that. I'm going to read it. It's Amos 1. It's a box 1 here. The words of Amos, a sheep breeder from Tekoa. Where was Tekoa? Which country was Tekoa in? Does anybody know? Was it in the northern kingdom in Israel? It was not. It was in Judea.
Mm-hmm.
So he's from Judea. But then what does he do? He prophesies concerning Israel. In the reigns of King Uzziah of Judah and Yerovam, son of Joash of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. So already from the beginning, we see that Amos is at a disadvantage because he is an outsider. He is coming from the kingdom of Judea. He is not from a high class of people. He's a sheep breeder. Later we hear that he's a tree tender. Apparently he's a seasonal worker. He's someone who works in agriculture, not as an owner of things, but rather somebody who works for other people. And he is an outsider, and he shows up in Israel. And his job is very different from that of Hosea in that his main emphasis is not on the relationship between people and God, not on idolatry in Hosea, but rather on the relationship between people, on the horrible corruption and exploitation that pervaded the society. And somehow he has to make these people listen to him, even though he's poor or relatively poor and coming from outside. So he's using a very interesting technique. Just like Hosea first made the people think that he's talking about things that are not their sins, but rather the sins of a different dynasty. At first, he talks about the sins and the punishment of other countries. Amos starts his prophecy by saying, and let's look briefly at the source sheet. We're going to go to box number, number 7. He says, "Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they threshed Gilad with threshing boards of iron." And then he says, "Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they exiled an entire population which they delivered to Edom." And he goes on and on and on about all these other countries that are their enemies of Israel, about how God is angry at them. And you can just imagine that his listeners in Israel would first look to them like, who is this guy? Like this, seasonal worker from Judea. What is he doing here? And then he says, God said, I will punish this nation and that nation. And they're like, yay, yay, starting to listen to him, starting to say, look at this guy. He's talking about the bad guys, and he says how they're going to be exiled. Then he says, thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, for 4 I will not revoke it. And everybody's really cheering. They're like, wow, he's even speaking against his own people. And then when they're really into it and they're willing to listen, he goes and delivers a shocking condemnation of themselves. And I'm looking at Amos 2, 6-8. It's in box 7. Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, for 4 I will not revoke it. Because they have sold for silver those whose cause was just, and the needy for a pair of sandals. Ah, you who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground, and make the humble walk a twisted course. Father and son go to the same girl, and thereby profane my holy name. They recline by every altar, on garments taken in pledge, and drink in the house of their God wine brought with fines they imposed. And that's a moment where everybody's like, what? We thought you were on our side. And instead, he delivers this sharp and painful condemnation in which he describes this with great irony and with great artistry, this reality where they're going to a temple to show their piety to God, wearing clothes that they took from a debtor, someone who couldn't pay this debt against the laws of the Torah, and drinking wine that comes from fines that they imposed on the poor. And indeed, in this generation, in the time of King Yerovam, we see a ridiculous disparity of wealth, that there's a huge class, there's this growing class of very, very, very rich people, and the masses who are left in total despondence, women who have to sell themselves into prostitution, men who are sold for slaves because they can't pay their debts, and the rich people, the elites, are convinced that they're so righteous because they're bringing offerings in the temple with that money that they extorted. And Amos goes on, and he uses very, very powerful imagery until at some point someone of authority had enough. And we will finish our discussion today with that moment because it really kind of brings it all together. Let's go down, down, down. Amaziah, who was a priest in the temple in Beit El, said, and we're in box 9 in Amos chapter 7. Amaziah said to Amos, seer, off with you to the land of Judah. Earn your living there and do your prophecies there, but don't ever prophesy again at Beit El, for it is a king's sanctuary and a royal palace. And with these words, Amaziah does us the favor of putting in very clear words the entire philosophy that underlies the life of that generation in the Northern Kingdom. Their entire philosophy assumes that the relationships in society are vertical. There's the king, and the king owns the temple, and the people who are in the temple should obey that king because it's his. And you, who are not getting money from the king, you're not part of this relationship, so go away. Go to wherever you are supposed to be. Don't be here. Go away. This is not your place. We have this relationship where the king is the patron and we obey, and you're not part of it. You're not getting the king's money. You're not eating the king's money, and therefore you should not be here at all. And Amos says, I'm not part of your system. I reject the way you understand the world. I'm not a prophet who's prophesying for a king when he is fed by him. I'm not answering to a king. And this is what he says. Amos answered Amaziah, I am not a prophet, by which he apparently means a professional prophet, a court prophet. And I am not a prophet's disciple. I am a cattle breeder and a tender of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me away from following the flock. And the Lord said to me, go, prophesy to my people Israel, and so hear the word of the Lord. You say I must not prophesy about the house of Israel or preach about the house of Yitzhak, but this I swear is what the Lord said. Your wife shall play the harlot in the town. Your sons and daughters shall fall by the sword, and your land shall be divided up with a measuring line. And you yourself shall die on unclean soil, for Israel shall be exiled from its soil. In these very harsh words, Amos is saying, you imagine that the world works in these vertical relationships? No, I'm not answering to your king. I'm not answering to any king. I am doing this because God told me to do it. And if God called me upon me to do it, it doesn't matter if I'm a professional prophet or a seasonal worker in agriculture. It's not the point. The point is that I, through my adherence to God, am no longer part of your society with all its assumptions about right and wrong and who should behave how to people in power. In a sense, and it's kind of funny, but he sounds almost like Jane Eyre. I don't know how familiar you are, but in Jane Eyre, who is a poor governess who falls in love with her rich employer, is angered with him when he seems to want to leave her, to send her away. And she says, do you think because I am poor, it's in the source sheet, obscure, plain, and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. And if God has gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I would have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. You might think that I'm silly for bringing a Jane Eyre quote here, but I wanted to show that throughout history and throughout cultures, there's a certain recognition that in the eyes of God, the real God, the monotheistic God, not the Baal with his power structured relationships with people, in the eyes of the real God, we are all equal and we all have equal dignity. And in a sense, what Amos is calling for here is for this recognition that just as Hosea said that our relationship with God needs to be on a more equal, even, mutual basis, also our relationship with each other shouldn't be founded on power, on a relationship of ba'alut, of ownership, but rather on this recognition that we are all called upon to act in God's service. And this makes us all, in essence, regardless of our wealth, regardless of our social position, regardless of who pays us for our meals and which country we're from, regardless of all of that, we are all equal. And with that powerful call, the powerful for a more even relationship with God and a more even relationship between people, Amos and Hosea are bequeathing all of us today more than just weird and beautiful and perplexing and poetic and odd words. They're bequeathing us a vision of the world where we share something, we create something together with God, with people, a world where we are really iconoclastic towards any idea of ownership, of ba'alut, either in relationship to God or to men. Thank you. Any questions, comments, suggestions, challenges? Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Just an administrative note, we're going to be having our last of this term 929 class on August 4th at 8:15 p.m. And then we're going to take certainly a 1 month, but maybe a 2 month break to let Rachel move back to Israel and settle in. But God willing, we'll be starting up again with the 929, probably mornings in America. So Rachel has it in the evenings. We'll let you know what time that will be. So keep an eye out for those emails. And my aunt has a whole bunch of classes coming up for the rest of the summer. So I hope you'll join us for that. We have Rabbi Jaffe is starting a 3-week class on the last king of Israel. So check that out. It's a 3-week course on Tuesday mornings, and keep an eye out for the other stuff that's coming up. So thank you everyone for coming.